community center music room always smelled the same. It was a mixture of old wood, lemon-scented polish, and the faint, dry scent of paper that had been handled 1,000 times. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, poured through a large, grimy window, illuminating scuffed linoleum floors and a circle of mismatched chairs. In the corner, like a quiet monarch, sat a grand piano, its black lacquer surface reflecting the room in a distorted, dreamlike way. This was where she felt most at home and most terrified. She was a woman who lived in the margins of spaces. At 35, she didn't have a name that anyone remembered easily, so they often just called her the quiet one. She preferred it that way. She chose her seat with the precision of a cartographer mapping a safe territory not too close to the front, where the teacher's gaze might linger and not too close to the back, where the more boisterous students tended to chatter. Her spot was 2 rows from the piano, slightly to the side, shielded by a large potted ficus that was always shedding a few sad yellow leaves. Her clothes were a study in invisibility's soft gray cardigans, faded blue jeans, sensible brown shoes. Nothing that caught the eye. Nothing that invited a second glance. The other members of the adult piano class were a collection of hopeful souls. There was a retired man in his 70s who played with a cheerful, thumping enthusiasm but little accuracy, his foot tapping an erratic, joyful rhythm against the floor. There were a couple of teenagers slumped in their chairs, their fingers flying over complex pop melodies they had learned by ear, their confidence a bright, noisy thing. And then there was her. She came to every class, her canvas bag holding a few well-worn books of sheet music and a small, anxious knot in her stomach. The teacher, Mr. Harrison, was a man in his late 60s, with a fringe of white hair around a balding head and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a gentle but firm way about him, patience that came from decades of coaxing music out of reluctant hands and hesitant hearts. He would move from student to student, offering a quiet word of encouragement, adjusting a wrist, demonstrating a tricky passage with his own surprisingly nimble fingers. When he came to her, he always knelt, bringing himself to her level. He never pushed too hard, but he asked questions that made her think. And how did the C-sharp minor feel this week? He'd ask, his voice a low rumble. She would just shrug, her gaze fixed on a loose thread on her cardigan. Okay, she'd mumble, the word barely escaping her lips. Did you try to play it with a little more longing? He'd press gently. It's a sad piece, but it's a beautiful sadness, like saying goodbye to a summer day. She would nod, but inside her heart would be pounding. Longing? Sadness? She couldn't even express those things with words, let alone with music. The fear of getting it wrong, of exposing a feeling she couldn't name, was paralyzing. So when her turn came to play for the class, her hands would hover over the keys for a long moment before she began. The notes would come out, all of them in the right order and at the right time, but they were small, timid things. They were whispers when they were meant to be a conversation. She played with a technical correctness that was impressive, but the soul of the music was locked away somewhere deep inside her, behind a door she didn't know how to open. The other students would offer polite, unenthusiastic applause, and she would quickly return to her seat, her face hot with a shame she couldn't explain. She didn't understand it herself. At home, in the small living room of her quiet apartment, with the curtains drawn and the world shut out, things were different. She had an old upright piano she had bought with money saved from 3 years of a boring office job. It was her only real luxury. At night, after a simple dinner, she would sit at that piano, and the person who existed in the community center would vanish. Her fingers, which felt clumsy and exposed in class, would become confident and sure. They would dance across the ivory keys, coaxing out sounds that made her own breath catch. She played things she would never dare to play in class. Complex, stormy sonatas by Beethoven that felt like thunderstorms in her chest. Haunting, nocturnal melodies by Chopin that seemed to speak directly to the loneliness in her soul. It was a secret world, a language only she and the piano understood. In those moments, she wasn't shy or quiet. She was powerful. She was a storyteller. The music was the one place where she could be honest. where she could let all the unspoken feelings, the quiet yearning, the flashes of anger, the deep well of sadness flow out of her without a single word. It was her most precious secret, and she guarded it fiercely. One Tuesday, after class had ended, she was slower than usual to pack her bag. The other students filed out, their chatter fading down the hallway. Mr. Harrison was busy erasing the whiteboard at the front of the room. She thought he was distracted, so she lingered by the grand piano. Her fingers, as if with a will of their own, gently traced the edge of a black key. She loved the feel of it, cool and smooth. She sat down on the bench, the plush velvet a soft comfort. The room was empty, silent, except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation. She thought she was alone. She didn't plan to play anything. She just wanted to feel the keys beneath her fingers one last time before she went back to her silent apartment. But then, a melody she had been working on at home popped into her head. It was a difficult piece, full of rapid, cascading notes and sudden shifts from loud to soft. A piece that required not just skill, but a boldness she never showed in public. On an impulse, a rare and reckless thing for her, she let her fingers fall. The first notes were hesitant, a test. But then, something took over. Her posture changed. Her back straightened. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. Her fingers, no longer trembling, began to fly. The music that filled the room was not the quiet whispering sound of her class performance. This was a torrent. It was a river of sound, sparkling with fast, high notes that sounded like tiny silver bells, then plunging into deep, resonant chords that vibrated through the floorboards. She played with a passion and a fury that was breathtaking. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration and emotion. The piano was weeping, then laughing, then crying out in a voice of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the most alive the room had ever been. She didn't see Mr. Harrison turn slowly from the whiteboard. She didn't see the look of utter astonishment on his face. An astonishment that slowly melted into a look of profound, knowing understanding. He stood perfectly still, not daring to breathe, not wanting to break the spell. He had seen the technical skill in her before, but this was something else entirely. This was the heart he had been searching for. This was the voice she had been hiding. He watched as her fingers coaxed the final ringing chord from the instrument and let it hang in the air, a beautiful, shimmering sound that slowly faded into silence. She opened her eyes. The spell broken, and the familiar blush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She quickly stood up, her brief moment of bravery evaporating. She grabbed her bag, her head down, and hurried towards the door, eager to escape before anyone could see her. As she passed him, she gave a small, almost invisible nod, her gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't say a word. He just nodded back, a slow, deliberate gesture. He watched her disappear down the hallway, a ghost retreating back into the shadows. But now, he knew her secret. He knew what was locked inside her, waiting for a key. And in that quiet, sunlit room, a plan began to form. The following week, the music room felt different. The sunlight still streamed through the grimy window, and the ficus plant in the corner still shed its sad yellow leaves. But for her, the geography of the space had been completely altered. Her usual seat, once a safe harbor, now felt exposed and vulnerable. She had a nagging feeling that the protective shadow of the potted tree was no longer enough. Every time Mr. Harrison glanced in her direction, which wasn't often, she felt a jolt, as if a tiny, invisible wire had been connected between them. She knew he had heard her. He knew that she knew. It was a silent, heavy secret that sat in the middle of the room, and she spent the entire class trying not to look at it. She played her assigned piece, a gentle sonatina by Clementi, with even more caution than usual. Her fingers were stiff, her movements small and apologetic. The notes, which at home could sound like a clear, flowing stream, came out in class as a hesitant trickle. When she finished, the polite applause felt like a verdict. She packed up her things with a speed that bordered on desperation, eager to escape the weight of her teacher's knowing gaze. But as she slung her canvas bag over her shoulder, he spoke. "Could you stay for a moment, please?" he asked, his voice calm and even. Her heart did a painful lurch. The other students glanced over with a mixture of curiosity and pity as they filed out. The retired man gave her a reassuring thumbs up, which somehow made everything feel worse. Soon, it was just the two of them and the grand piano, sitting in the center of the room like a judge's bench. She remained in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Mr. Harrison didn't come over to her right away. He went to the whiteboard and began to erase the week's notes, the squeak of the marker against the surface filling the silence. He was taking his time, and the waiting was torture. Her mind raced, conjuring 1,000 different things he might say. Would he tell her she was a fraud for hiding her talent? Would he ask her why she was so afraid? Would he demand that she play like that for the class? Each thought was more terrifying than the last. Finally, he turned and walked towards her. He wasn't holding a book. He was holding a single loose piece of sheet music, folded in half. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could smell the faint scent of chalk and coffee that clung to him. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his expression not angry but thoughtful, as if he were trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "The winter recital is in 6 weeks, he began, his voice gentle. "I've asked everyone to start thinking about what they'd like to play. It's a chance to share something you've worked on, something you're proud of." She just nodded, her gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the floor near her shoe. She had already decided she would be sick that day. It was a plan she'd been relying on for years. "I've been thinking about your piece," he continued. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. "Oh no," she started to say, her voice a shaky whisper. "I was just going to... I think the Claymania is nice. I could work on that one, make it better." He smiled a little, a sad, knowing smile. "The Claymania is fine. It's a nice piece. But it's not you. It's not the music I heard you play last week." Her face flooded with heat. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. The secret was out. He had said it out loud. "That was nothing," she stammered. "I was just messing around." "It was a mess. It was a beautiful mess," he corrected her softly. "It was honest. That's what music is supposed to be." He unfolded the piece of paper he was holding and placed it on the music stand of the piano. "I want you to play this." She didn't want to look. She wanted to keep her eyes glued to the floor, but her gaze was drawn upwards, as if by a magnetic force. The title at the top of the page was in an elegant, old-fashioned script, La Campanella. Underneath it, the name of the composer, Franz Liszt. She didn't need to know anything about classical music to understand what she was seeing. The page was not a collection of notes. It was a storm. It was a blizzard of black ink. There were sections where the notes were packed so tightly together they looked like solid black columns. There were dizzying, zigzagging lines that ran up and down the staff, and little sharp symbols that seemed to appear on almost every note. It looked impossible. It looked like a cruel joke. She shook her head, a slow, frantic motion. "No," she whispered, the word full of genuine terror. "No, I can't. I can't even read some of this." "You can," he said, his voice firm but kind. He pointed to a section of rapid, high-pitched notes. "This part, the little bell, that's what the title means. It's meant to sound like tiny crystal bells ringing. Your fingers are perfect for it. They're long and they're quick. I've seen them." "That was different," she insisted, her voice cracking. "That was at home. There's no one there. I can't do this in front of people." "I'm not asking you to do it in front of people tomorrow," he said patiently. "I'm asking you to try. For the next 6 weeks, I want you to try. This piece isn't about playing the right notes. Any monkey can be trained to play the right notes. This piece is about courage. It's about taking a huge, terrifying leap and trusting that you'll land on your feet. You have the skill. You have more skill than anyone else in that class, maybe more than I've ever seen in a student. But skill is useless if it's kept in a cage." He leaned a little closer. "What you need is the courage. And sometimes, the only way to find courage is to be forced to walk through the fire. This piece," he tapped the paper, "is your fire. She stared at the music, at the terrifying labyrinth of notes. It didn't look like music. It looked like a map of a place she never wanted to go. It represented everything she was afraid of. Failure, humiliation, being seen, and then judged and found wanting. "I'll mess it up," she said, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Everyone will laugh." "No one will laugh," he said, his voice unwavering. "And if you mess it up, you mess it up. So what? It's just a piano recital in a community center. It's not the end of the world. But what if you don't mess it up? What if you walk through that fire and you come out the other side shining? Don't you want to know what that feels like?" She didn't have an answer for that. All she could feel was the cold dread pooling in her stomach. He stood up, leaving the sheet music on the stand. "Take it home," he said. "Just look at it. Don't even try to play it tonight. Just look at it and think about it. The decision is yours, of course. But I believe this is the next step for you. I really do." He walked back to his desk. Leaving her alone with the piano and the terrifying piece of paper, she sat there for a long time after he left. The room grew dark as the sun set, the shapes of the chairs and the music stands melting into shadows. Finally, with a sigh that felt like it came from the bottom of her soul, she took the sheet music. Her hands were trembling as she folded it and slipped it into her canvas bag. It felt less like paper and more like a lead weight. The walk home was a blur. The city lights, the sounds of traffic, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, it all faded into a dull roar in the background. All she could think about was that page full of black notes. In her small apartment, the silence felt accusatory. Her old upright piano, usually a source of comfort, now looked like an accomplice to her teacher's cruel plan. She didn't even take the music out of her bag. She just went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the dark, her mind replaying the scene over and over, his words echoing in her head. "You're fire. What if you come out shining?" The next day, she finally pulled the music out. She spread it on the stand, the stark black and white, a stark contrast to the faded, comfortable room. She sat on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys, just as she had the day he heard her. But this time, there was no reckless impulse. There was only fear. She tried to play the first line. Her fingers, which had danced so effortlessly just last week, felt like stiff foreign objects. They fumbled, they tripped, they landed on wrong notes, with a jarring clang. The sound was ugly. It was an insult to the piano. She tried again, and again. The result was the same. A messy, discordant jumble of noise, frustration boiled up inside her, hot and sharp. She slammed her hands down on the keys, producing a loud, angry chord that vibrated through the room. "I can't," she yelled out loud to the empty apartment. Tears of anger and humiliation streamed down her face. This was a mistake. It was all a terrible mistake. She would call Mr. Harrison tomorrow. She would tell him she was quitting the class. She would tell him she was moving. She would tell him anything to make this feeling go away. She crumpled the sheet music into a tight, angry ball and threw it across the room. It landed near the window, a white ball of failure. She stood up and paced the small room, her heart pounding. But then she stopped. Her eyes fell on the crumpled paper. She thought about his words, about the look in his eyes. It wasn't cruelty she had seen. It was belief. A deep, unwavering belief that she was better than the quiet, frightened person she presented to the world. He saw a fire in her that she couldn't see herself. Slowly, she walked over and picked up the ball of paper. She carefully, gently uncrumpled it, smoothing out the wrinkles as best she could. There were a few new tears in the paper, but the notes were still there. The challenge was still there. She carried it back to the piano and placed it on the stand once more. She took a deep breath. She couldn't play the whole thing. She couldn't even play one line. But maybe she could play one note, the very first note. She looked at it, found it on the keyboard, and pressed it down. It was a clear, perfect C sharp. It was just one note, but it was a start. And in the heavy silence of the room, that single, pure sound felt like a tiny, flickering candle in a vast, dark cave. The single. Perfect C sharp hung in the air of her small apartment, a tiny beacon in a vast sea of doubt. It was a promise, but the morning after, the promise felt like a lie. The sunlit reality of the following day brought with it the full, terrifying weight of the challenge. The crumpled sheet music, smoothed out but still bearing the creases of her anger, sat on the music stand like a declaration of war. The war was between her and the tangled black notes on the page. And she had a sinking feeling she was about to lose. Her first real attempt was a disaster. The piece began with a cascade of notes, a sparkling waterfall of sound that was meant to be light and effervescent. What came out of her piano was a thud, a messy, slurred mush of sound that resembled a handful of pebbles being thrown against the wood. Her fingers, which had felt so elegant the night before, now felt like clumsy, uncooperative strangers. They tripped over each other, landing on the wrong keys with jarring, discordant crashes. The sound was so ugly, so completely opposite of the music she heard in her head, that she physically flinched. She tried again, and again. Each attempt was worse than the last. The frustration began as a low simmer in her stomach, but it quickly grew into a boiling rage. This wasn't music. This was a cruel prank. The notes were packed too tightly together. The jumps between them were impossibly wide, and the rhythm was confusing. Teasing ghosts that she could never quite catch. She would isolate one measure, a particularly vicious-looking tangle of 16th notes, and play it 50 times. 50 times it came out wrong. On the 51st time, it was still wrong. But now her left hand was cramping. A sharp, protesting pain shooting up her forearm, she slammed the lid of the keyboard down, the bang echoing through the silent apartment like a gunshot. She stood up, her whole body trembling. She walked to the window and looked out at the brick wall of the building opposite. This was impossible. Mr. Harrison was wrong. He had heard one fleeting, beautiful moment and had built a castle of expectation on it, not realizing the foundation was just sand. She wasn't a courageous musician waiting to be unleashed. She was a fraud who had gotten lucky once. The days bled into a week, and the week into 2. The routine became a form of self-torture. She would wake up, her first thought not of coffee or the day ahead, but of the looming black notes on the page. She would practice before leaving for her dull office job, her fingers stiff and cold, producing nothing but mistakes. She would come home, eat a silent dinner, and return to the piano until her eyes burned and her back ached. Her world shrank to the dimensions of her small living room. The pile of unopened mail on her counter grew. Her friends stopped calling, their messages going unanswered. The piece became her tormentor. It followed her through her days. She would be at her desk staring at a spreadsheet. She would hear a snippet of the melody in her head, the fast, high-pitched notes of the little bell mocking her. She would be on the bus, and the rhythm of the engine would morph into the relentless, driving tempo of the piece. It was a constant, oppressive presence, a reminder of her failure. The date of the winter recital, which had once been a distant abstraction, now glared at her from every calendar she owned, a red circle of impending doom. There were moments when she almost gave up. She would picture herself on stage, the blinding spotlight, the sea of expectant faces. She would see her fingers fumbling, hear the ugly, crashing notes, feel the wave of pity and embarrassment from the audience. The image was so vivid, so real, that it made her feel physically sick. One evening, after a particularly brutal practice session where she had burst into tears of pure frustration, she actually picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over Mr. Harrison's number. She would tell him she was moving. She would tell him she had developed a sudden allergy to piano keys. She would say anything to make it stop, but she didn't make the call. Something, a stubborn, tiny spark of the pride he had seen in her, refused to be extinguished. Instead of quitting, she changed her strategy. She stopped trying to conquer the whole piece. That was like trying to eat an entire elephant in one bite. She decided to focus on just one bite. She went back to that one measure, the tangle of notes that had made her hand cramp. But this time, she didn't try to play it at speed. She slowed it down, so slowly that each note was a separate, deliberate event. Right-hand note, left-hand note. Together, it was agonizingly boring. It felt less like making music and more like performing a tedious, repetitive factory job. She played that one measure, that glacial pace, for 100 times. Then 200. Her fingers began to learn the pathway, not through inspiration, but through sheer mind-numbing repetition. It was like carving a groove into a piece of wood. After a few days of this, the groove was deep enough that her fingers started to find it on their own. Then she tried to speed it up, just a little. It was still messy, but it was less messy than before. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible improvement, but it was there. It was the first crack in the wall. This became her new approach. She broke the monster down into 100 tiny monsters. She spent a week on just the opening bars. She spent another week on a series of huge, leaping chords that required her right hand to fly from one end of the keyboard to the other. At first, she consistently missed, landing on a thudding whole note instead of the sparkling high note she was aiming for. She practiced the leap over and over until her arm felt like it would fall off. Then, one afternoon, she landed it, not once, but 3 times in a row. The sound was clean, bright, and true. A small, surprised laugh escaped her lips. It was the first time she had felt anything like joy in weeks. Slowly, painstakingly, the pieces began to fit together. The process was not glamorous. It was a grind. It was hours of her life, traded for small victories that no one else would ever see or appreciate. But as she stitched the little monsters together, something began to change. The music was no longer just a collection of impossible tasks. It was starting to sound like a whole. The little bell theme, which had been a source of so much frustration, began to emerge, ringing out with a clear, crystalline sound that made her heart feel a little lighter. She started to hear the story in the music. It wasn't just a display of technical difficulty. There was a playfulness in the fast notes, a teasing quality. There were moments of deep, resonant sadness in the slow, heavy chords. And there were flashes of brilliant, defiant joy. She found herself thinking about Mr. Harrison's words. This piece is about courage. She was starting to understand. The music itself was a struggle. It was a conversation between fear and bravery, between doubt and triumph. And in playing it, she was having that same conversation with herself. One night, about a month before the recital, she was practicing late. The apartment was dark except for the small lamp she used to illuminate the music. She was exhausted, her mind foggy with fatigue. She had been working on a particularly difficult transition, and it just wasn't coming together. She felt the old frustration rising again. She was about to give up for the night, to go to bed and face the battle again tomorrow. But then, a strange feeling came over her. Instead of fighting the music, she decided to just let it go. She closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and she just started to play. She didn't think about the notes, or the fingering, or the fear. She just let her hands do what they had learned to do over all those countless tedious hours. She didn't stop when she made a mistake. She just kept going, and the music that filled the room was not the hesitant, whispering sound of her class performances, nor was it the messy, frustrated sound of her early practice sessions. It was something new. It was strong. It was confident. Her fingers flew across the keys, navigating the treacherous passages with a newfound assurance. The little bells rang out, clear and pure. The big chords thundered with power. She played through the whole piece, from beginning to end, without stopping. When she struck the final, resonant chord and let it hang in the air, she opened her eyes. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was full of the sound she had just created. It wasn't perfect. There were smudged notes and shaky moments, but it was whole. It was alive. She sat there in the dim light, her hands resting on the keys, a slow, tired smile spreading across her face. The fear of the recital was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it was sharing space with something else. A quiet, steady hum of resolve. She could do it. She wasn't sure how, and she was terrified of what would happen if she failed. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she could do it. The day of the recital arrived not with a sunrise, but with a feeling of dread that was heavier than any blanket. She woke up long before her alarm, her heart already thumping a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The apartment was dark and silent, but it felt loud with the ghosts of all the hours she had spent practicing. Her old upright piano, which had become her closest confidant and her harshest critic, sat in the corner of the living room, a black shape in the dimness. She didn't go near it. To touch it now would be like touching a live wire. She called in sick to work, her voice a thin, unconvincing rasp over the phone. There was no way she could sit in a cubicle and pretend to care about spreadsheets and emails. Her entire world had shrunk to the single, terrifying event that would take place that evening. She tried to eat, but a piece of toast felt like cardboard in her dry mouth. She tried to read, but the words swam on the page, meaningless squiggles that couldn't compete with the roaring in her ears. She just walked around her small apartment, a restless ghost in her own life, picking things up and putting them down again as the afternoon light began to fade. Casting long shadows across the floor, she knew she could avoid it no longer. She had to go. The thought of not showing up, of disappointing Mr. Harrison, was somehow worse than the thought of facing the audience. He had believed in her, had seen something in her that she couldn't see herself. To let him down would be a different kind of failure, a deeper one. Getting ready was a mechanical process. She showered, the water doing nothing to wash away the layer of cold fear that clung to her skin. She looked in her closet at the sea of gray and beige, and for the first time, felt a pang of something else. Defiance. She pushed past the cardigans and pulled out a simple, dark blue dress she had bought years ago and never worn. It was plain, but the color was deep and steady, like the night sky. Putting it on felt like wearing a small piece of armor. The community center was buzzing when she arrived. The familiar hallways were filled with people dressed in their best clothes, their faces bright with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The air hummed with the sound of chatter and the occasional distant scale being played on a violin. She kept her head down, her canvas bag clutched tightly in her hand, and made her way towards the small auditorium at the back of the building. Every friendly hello and good luck felt like a pebble thrown against the glass wall of her anxiety. Backstage, more accurately backstage curtain, was a controlled chaos. The other performers were gathered in small groups, warming up their instruments, their voices a low murmur. The teenager with the flashy pop song was listening to music through headphones, his body bouncing with an easy confidence she couldn't imagine. The retired man was humming his simple, cheerful melody, a look of pure bliss on his face. They were all in their own worlds, preparing for their moment. She stood alone, an island of terror in a sea of calm. Then she saw him. Mr. Harrison was standing near the entrance to the stage, talking to a parent. He looked calm and composed, as if he did this every day. When he saw her, he excused himself and walked over. He didn't say anything about the music, or the recital, or courage. He just looked at her, his eyes kind and steady. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. She just nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good," he said, giving her a small, gentle smile. "Just remember to breathe. That's all. Just breathe." He gave her a slight, encouraging nod and then moved away, leaving her with that simple, profound piece of advice. Breathe. She tried, but her breaths were short and shallow, catching in her throat. The recital began. She could hear the muffled sounds from the other side of the heavy velvet curtain. A polite smattering of applause, a few tentative notes on a flute, a confident burst from a young violinist. With each performance, her turn got closer. The knot in her stomach tightened until it felt like a stone. She could feel a fine sheen of sweat on her forehead, and her hands, when she looked at them, were pale and trembling. Then she heard her name. It wasn't a loud announcement, just a quiet voice from the stage, but it cut through all the other noise like a knife. It was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. This was it. There was no more time. She walked towards the opening in the curtain, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The journey from the wings to the piano was the longest walk of her life. The stage lights hit her like a physical force, a blinding white wall that erased everything else. The auditorium, which she knew held only 100 or so people, felt like a vast dark cavern. The faces were a blur, a single monstrous entity with 100 eyes, all staring at her. The piano, the grand piano from the music room, sat center stage. Looking impossibly large and imposing under the lights, she reached the bench and sat down. The plush velvet felt soft and unsteady beneath her. She placed her shaking hands on the keys, which were cool and smooth. For a moment, she just sat there, her mind a complete blank. The roaring in her ears was so loud, she was sure everyone could hear it. She couldn't remember the first note. She couldn't remember anything. The whole piece, all those hours of practice had vanished from her mind. Leaving only a gaping hole of terror, she took a breath, a ragged, desperate gasp. She thought of Mr. Harrison's words. Just breathe. She closed her eyes. She shut out the lights, the blurry faces, the monstrous cavern. She blocked out the fear and the doubt. She imagined she was back in her own living room, the only light coming from a small lamp. It was just her and the piano. Her fingers, still trembling, found the opening notes. The first few were hesitant, small and uncertain. A couple of notes were smudged, their clarity bleeding into one another. A flicker of panic shot through her. *C, you can't do it. You're going to fail. But then something shifted. Her fingers, remembering the countless hours of repetition, found the next phrase. And the next. The music began to flow, not as a torrent but as a steady, determined stream. She played the first section, her eyes still closed. The initial hesitation began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. Her fingers, which had felt like clumsy strangers, were becoming familiar again. They knew the pathway. They had carved it into their muscle memory. And then she reached the first cascade of high, fast notes, the little bell. Instead of fearing it, she embraced it. Her fingers flew, dancing across the upper registers of the keyboard, and the sound that came out was not a mess, but a series of clear, sparkling notes that rang out like tiny crystal chimes. Something amazing happened in the room. The low hum of the ventilation system, the rustle of a program, the quiet cough from the back, it all stopped. A profound, attentive silence fell over the auditorium. It was a living, breathing silence, a silence created by 100 people holding their breath at the same time. They were no longer a faceless monster. They were captivated. She didn't see it. She didn't see the people leaning forward in their seats, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. She didn't see the teenager with the pop song, his mouth slightly agape. She didn't see the retired man, a look of pure joy on his face. She was no longer on a stage. She was inside the music. She was the storm of fast notes, the deep sadness of the slow chords, the defiant flash of the melody. Her fingers, now sure and strong, coaxed sounds from the piano that she didn't know she was capable of making. The music was no longer a struggle. It was a liberation. It was a voice for all the things she could never say, a story of fear and bravery, of doubt and triumph. She played through the most difficult passages, the ones that had caused her so many hours of frustration. The huge leaping chords, the dizzying runs, the complex interplay between her hands. Her body swayed slightly with the music, her head tilted, lost in a world only she could hear. The piano was weeping, then laughing, then crying out with a voice of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the most alive the room had ever been. She approached the final, climactic section, a whirlwind of sound that built to a powerful, crescendoing peak. Her hands were a blur, a storm of motion and emotion. And then, with one final, powerful gesture, she struck the last chord. It was a huge, resonant sound that filled the entire space, a wave of pure, triumphant sound that washed over everyone. She let it hang in the air. For a full 3 seconds, there was absolute, perfect stillness. The silence was so complete, it was louder than any noise she had ever heard. It was a sacred space, filled with the ghost of the music that had just been born. Then she opened her eyes. The blinding lights were still there, but they didn't seem so harsh anymore. She looked out at the blurry sea of faces, her expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. A single thought echoed in the sudden quiet of her mind. Did I just do that? The silence that followed the final chord was a living thing. It was a sacred, shimmering space that stretched on for an eternity, filled only by the ghost of the music that had just been born. She sat on the bench, her fingers still resting on the keys, her body frozen in the posture of the last note. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of motion and emotion just seconds before, was now a complete and utter blank. The blinding stage lights, the vast dark cavern of the room, the 100 pairs of eyes, it all faded away, leaving only the ringing echo of the sound she had created. Then, a single person in the front row started to clap. It was not polite, gentle applause. It was a sharp, decisive sound, like the crack of a whip. It was followed by another, and then another, until a wave of sound crashed over her. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. It was a physical force, a warm, overwhelming current of pure, unadulterated acclaim that lifted her right out of her seat. People were standing up. All of them. The blurry sea of faces rose as one, a single, unified entity, expressing something she couldn't comprehend. It was too much. It was too big. A huge, shaky breath she didn't know she was holding finally escaped her lips, and it came out as a sob. She quickly brought a hand up to her mouth, but it was too late. The tears came, not tears of sadness or frustration, but of a release so profound it felt like her entire soul was pouring out of her. She was vaguely aware of someone guiding her off the stage, a gentle hand on her back. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She stumbled through the heavy velvet curtain, back into the controlled chaos of the wings. The world rushed back in a dizzying flood of sound and light. The other performers were there, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. The teenager with the flashy pop song was just staring at her, his mouth slightly agape, his headphones silent around his neck. The retired man, who had been humming his simple tune before, was now looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. No one knew what to say. What could you possibly say after witnessing something like that? She found a small, empty corner and leaned against the wall, trying to make herself small again, trying to disappear. But it was no use. The armor of her shyness had been shattered, and she was exposed, raw and trembling. She felt a hand on her shoulder and flinched, expecting another stranger's praise. But when she looked up, it was Mr. Harrison. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his eyes looking into hers. They were shining, and a single proud tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He didn't offer a hollow "good job" or "I knew you could do it," just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod of understanding, of recognition, of shared victory. In that silent exchange, he told her everything she needed to know. He saw her. He saw the fire, the struggle, the courage, and he was proud. She managed a small, watery smile in return. The first genuine smile she had felt in months. The rest of the recital went on in a blur. She barely heard the other performers. Her mind was still replaying the experience. The feeling of her fingers flying across the keys, the sound of the music filling the space, the roar of the applause. It felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. But the dampness on her cheeks and the steady hum of adrenaline in her veins told her it was real. When the final performer took their bow and the recital was officially over, the audience began to spill out into the lobby for refreshments. Her first instinct was to find the back exit and run, to get back to the safety of her apartment before anyone could talk to her. She gathered her things, her movements jerky and automatic, but as she headed for the door, she found her path blocked. It was an elderly woman, her hair a soft white cloud, her eyes bright and intelligent. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just had to tell you. That piece? My husband used to play that for me when we were young. He wasn't a professional, you understand. He just loved it. Hearing you play it tonight, it was like he was right there with me again. It was beautiful. Truly beautiful." The woman's words were so simple, so honest, that they bypassed all of her defenses. She didn't see a critic or a judge. She just saw a person who had been moved by her music. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words came out clearly, without a tremor. She tried to move on, but another person stopped her. This time, it was a man in his 40s, holding the hand of his young daughter. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, but my daughter here just started piano lessons. She was getting frustrated, thinking about quitting. After hearing you play, well, I think you just changed her mind." The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7, looked up at her with wide, worshipful eyes. She looked down at the child, and something inside her shifted. All those hours of solitary, frustrating practice, all the struggle and the doubt, had led to this. It wasn't just about her own fear anymore. Her music had reached out and touched someone else, had inspired a little girl to keep going. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling far more powerful than the fleeting thrill of the applause. "Don't ever quit," she said to the child, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's worth it. I promise." She didn't run away after that. She stayed. She let people talk to her. She accepted their compliments with a quiet thank you and a small, genuine smile. She was still shy, still an introvert at heart. But the wall of terror that had surrounded her for so long had been reduced to rubble. She was no longer a ghost in the margins of the room. She was present. She was seen. The walk home was completely different from the walk there. The night air felt cool and clean on her face. The city lights, which had seemed like a blurry, intimidating mess on the way to the recital, now seemed to sparkle with a friendly, celebratory glow. The roar of the traffic was no longer a source of anxiety, but just the sound of a living, breathing city. She walked with her head up, her shoulders back. The fear was still there, a faint echo in the back of her mind, but it was no longer in control. It was just a quiet background noise, easily ignored. Back in her apartment, the silence was welcoming. It wasn't an accusatory silence anymore, but a peaceful one. She dropped her bag by the door and walked over to her old upright piano. The crumpled sheet music for La Campanella was still on the stand, a relic of a battle fought and won. She picked it up, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palm. The notes that had once looked like an impenetrable storm now looked familiar, almost friendly. They were a map of her journey. She sat down on the bench, the plush velvet a familiar comfort. She didn't play La Campanella. She didn't feel the need to. Instead, her fingers found the keys of a simple, soft melody she had learned years ago. A gentle piece by Debussy. She had always played for herself. The notes that came out were not the timid, apologetic whispers of the past. They were clear and steady, full of a quiet confidence. They were the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. She played for a long time, not for an audience, not for a teacher, but for herself. And in the quiet of her small apartment, filled with the sound of her own music, she finally felt, for the first time in her entire life, perfectly, completely at home.